Thank you for the talk. I don't want to get that feedback. You mentioned a couple of things being within the apostolic tradition and the scriptures. Pope Francis recently mentioned his keenness for female deacons. Your eyes are rolling. Do you think that this will open the door to the debate on female priests again?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I don't know that he expressed keenness for female deacons. What I think he said was that in response to a gathering of religious sisters, women's orders, I think what he'd said was that he would refer the matter to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to look at the question of women deacons. This, the important point about that, just like, sorry, if I could just move to one side for a second, I'll come back to that, but just say something, for example, about this question of marriage, which has been, people have been much concerned with, in particular the question of admitting those who have been divorced and remarried to the sacraments. Interestingly, in connection with that, the thing that he was very interested in was, I think it's Canon 8 of the Council of Nicaea, which concerns, the details don't really matter, but it concerns keeping communion with some, between more and less rigorous branches of the Church. Now, why I mention that is because it's very interesting, when the Pope thinks about these fundamental questions, he looks to see, and this is exactly in line with what I was saying earlier on, he looks to see what the tradition is. And so the question as to whether or not there can be women deacons is in part, as he sees it, a question of, is there any evidence in the apostolic period or the post-apostolic period of there having been women deacons? Now, I think that's an interesting question. Scholars have debated this, and no doubt there will be reference to those discussions, that scholarly work, in whatever document the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, produces. But even if the conclusion of that were that there is historical precedent, there would still have to be a prudential question as to whether or not in the present time it was an appropriate precedent to follow. But even if it were judged that it were, that would not open the door to women priests. Let me just say something about the issue of women priests. I myself, for what it's worth, it's not worth very much, are theologically agnostic on the question of women priests. I have no view on the issue of women priests. I've read arguments on either side of this, first level arguments as it were. Some of them are just pretty bad. Some people think it's an issue of equality, which is ridiculous. Some people think it's completely excluded on the basis of some very metaphysical view about the nature of man and woman and so on. I'm not persuaded by that. So I just wait to see what the Church decides. But I'll say this about it. There have been, it's not as if the Church hasn't thought about these things. There have been declarations on the matter. The one that would immediately come to mind is one of John Paul II, which look certainly as if they excluded so far as the Church of Rome is concerned. Whether they're absolute and definitive final resolutions is perhaps another question, but I think that for Roman Catholics that had those words of John Paul II, acting as Pope, have to be taken very seriously. But there is a broader and more extensive issue about this, which I think people just don't recognise, and it's this. The greatest scandal of Christian division, so far as Roman Catholicism is concerned, is not the separation of the 16th century, the Reformation. It's the Great Schism. It's the separation between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. The only ecclesial bodies that the Roman Catholic Church recognises as churches, as apostolic entities, are the Eastern Rite churches in communion with it, and the Orthodox. The post-Reformation churches, it regards as ecclesial communities, that is to say, sets of people united in their beliefs, and it respects that and so on, but it does not regard them as churches in the technical sense. That is to say, it does not regard them as part of the apostolic succession. It does regard the Russian church in that way, it does regard the Greek church in that way, and there are 21 churches that are in communion with Rome that are Eastern Rite in one way or another, Antiochian, Copts and so on. Now, Rome's greatest desire is to see reunification of Christendom, that is to say, reunification of Catholic Christianity, the reunification of East and West. And it believes that it cannot act unilaterally on an issue that would constitute a definitive and final separation with the Eastern Church. So there isn't going to be any movement on that issue short of a full ecumenical council, that is to say, a council bringing together the Western and Eastern churches. And my betting right now is there isn't going to be an ecumenical council for at least 250 years. So it's off the cards, unless the Spirit intervenes, we shall see. But the Roman Catholic Church will not proceed unilaterally on that question. It simply will not proceed unilaterally on that question. So there is, as far as I can see, no possibility of the ordination of women to the priesthood short of that being agreed in a full ecumenical council of the Western and Eastern churches. And I don't think that, and Pope Francis is aware of that fact, and nothing in what he said recently should be taken as an indication of inching towards ordination of women to the priesthood.
We have another question in the middle here.
Just in regard to the broad campaigns that you mentioned, to get more specific, we have an upcoming plebiscite, or potentially the plebiscite on same-sex marriage. I say potential because one party wants to put it to the Parliament and one to the people. And I'm just wondering what you think the most convincing argument against the slogan of marriage equality is.
I think I'm going to sit down. Right. Well, look, I mean, I've said this in another context, and I might, if I get a chance in between giving all these talks, write something about this. Look, here's how you have to think about this. The expression marriage equality is just a slogan. Right? I mean, that's what campaigns do. They sloganize. I don't criticize for that in the slightest. But it really doesn't bear much scrutiny. And that for two reasons. First of all, we can go back to as well philosophy for a moment. Aristotle in the Politics, he discusses questions of justice and equality and so on, what he calls equity. And he says that if you are distributing some resource, then you have to exercise judgment in who you make that available to. You don't treat all cases in the same way. You treat all like cases in the same way. So as he says, if you're distributing musical instruments, you give the musical instruments to those who can play them, not to babies and those who can't. Now, the marriage is a kind of social resource. It's a societal resource. And before you start distributing it out, you have to think what its purposes are. And the purposes of marriage, I mean, why society has an interest in marriage, is because it's the locus, primarily, the locus of procreation, the having and raising of children. Now, of course, children exist outside of the context of biological families. But sometimes people say, oh, we have a right to have children. I don't think anybody has a right to have children. I don't think anybody has a right to be assisted to have children, whether they need infertility treatment or whether or not they are gay and so themselves can't have children. I don't say, by the way, that infertility shouldn't be treated. I just say there isn't a right to have children. There's a right not to be interfered with in the natural process of having children, but there's no general right to be provided with children. And so the locus, society's interest in the conceiving and bearing and raising of children is a serious one. And it has recognized the role of the family in that connection. And marriage exists in part, not entirely, but in part, to provide and validate and give societal support in that context. Point number one. So you treat like cases alike, and cases just of erotic desire don't constitute by themselves a ground for marriage. Secondly, people who say we want marriage equality actually don't mean that. They don't mean let anybody who's competent and can give consent get married. They don't, for example, at least I haven't heard them say, that the campaign is that any adult existing in any relationship to any other number of people should be allowed to get married. What they mean is, let's have a bourgeois extension of male-female marriage. Let's have all the kind of approbation that comes with a sentimentalized conception of marriage. We'd like that too. They don't want to see that extended to polyamorous marriages, multi-party marriages. They don't want to see it extended to incestuous marriages. So the question then is this: if anybody, as it were, is behaving irresponsibly, it's those who assert marriage equality but don't really mean it. They don't mean let anybody have access to marriage. They mean let us have access to marriage, but don't give it to those other sets of people either. So unless somebody really is prepared to argue the case for incestuous marriage, for polyamorous marriage, then they're not really entitled to the expression marriage equality. They don't believe in marriage equality, they believe in marriage extension to a particular group or set. So the phraseology, as it were, belies a prejudice. And of course that's ironic, because the slogan is meant to be a slogan put before people who are accused of being prejudicial. Now, the only people who I think have a non-arbitrary account of who should be allowed to marry are people who believe in traditional marriage, because they can give their account in terms of the complementarity of male and female. But once you depart from that, any extension short of universalism is arbitrary. So the moral equality argument really just doesn't bear the kind of reflection that you would expect a first-year undergraduate in philosophy to give it.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Haldane. I was there 2 months ago at Notre Dame, and I was equally impressed tonight with what you had to say. My question relates to when you brought up the topic in relation to the extreme vanity, as you called it, of people who reference their own era, their own time, or the present, as you said, as if it were a pivotal moment in history. And I really liked how you said that it basically summed up an extreme form of vanity as if their period in history was superior or to all others because they are currently living in that present time. And now you might have recalled last year, the Canadian Prime Minister, in response to a question by the press of why is his cabinet so diverse, he simply replied, it's 2015. And you'll find in a lot of, in terms of the culture wars which you discussed tonight, often the response to things in relation to questions on why there should be same-sex marriage or all other kinds of progressive causes, it's the current year, it's 2016, it's the 21st century. Now, my view of this is an extreme form of intellectual laziness. Would you agree?
Yes, next question. I really do feel a very strong temptation coming on to start singing, but anyway, I'll try. I shall have to resist this. Or maybe I won't. Anyway, yeah. No, I do agree with that. Look, distinguish the task of conserving, that I spoke about earlier on, is conserving the deposit of faith, which is the responsibility of bishops and pope. I mean, I would say within the Protestant denominations, there is also a task of conserving that has to go on, which is conserving Scripture in its authenticity, not just splintered into individual interpretation, but that's another matter. So distinguish the task of conserving, preserving from decay, protecting and so on, from conservatism. Now, if somebody says, I'm a conservative, or they say, I'm a progressive, or they say, I'm a traditionalist, or whatever it may be, I'm inclined to say, you haven't really yet told me anything about what you actually believe. And what I mean by that is that these are in themselves, these terms are pretty empty. They only get their meaning by being associated with particular beliefs and so on. So, for example, I do think, this is a general point, I do think that the study of history is extremely valuable, and particularly valuable perhaps right now, and because people have lost a sense of it and are generally ignorant about it. I mentioned, for example, the question of sort of debates around Catholicism as having a precedent in the 1890s, not 1899. I would suggest you look at that papal encyclical and look at the background to it. It's very interesting. But with regard to this issue of progressivism and the use of the term progressivism, I would commend a study of the rise of National Socialism and indeed Mussolini's fascism from the period of the late 20s into the 1930s and so on. It's very characteristic of the fascists, of the Italian fascists, and of the National Socialist Party to describe themselves as progressives. They see themselves as overthrowing inherited conservative values. One concern that both of them had was to destroy conservative political parties. And the reason that they sought to do so was that they wanted to sort of induce a new revolutionary spirit, a sense that of overthrowing the past and moving forward with a new conception of what human relations ought to be. So, for example, breaking up the traditional family, which the Nazis in particular had a great hostility to, because they saw it as a bastion of protection against totalitarian politics. And so the rhetoric of Nazism in the 1930s was the rhetoric of progressive politics. We are the future, we are the cutting edge of history. The phrase then hadn't been coined, but it could easily have served their purposes. You want to be on the right side of history. So the right side of history for Hitler and his henchmen from 1933 onwards was the kind of totalitarian National Socialism that he espoused. And as I say, those who were conservatives, those who espoused traditional Christian values of the family and so on, were despised by that movement and so on. Now my point, I mean, the only reason I mention that is because the terms progressive and conservative in themselves carry no value. It's the content of what you believe. To say that when people say today they're progressive, what they really mean is they say, I'm right. That's what they mean. They're patting themselves on the back for being on the right side. Just like when people say you've got to be on the right side of history, I'm inclined to say, which side is that exactly? I mean, what did you think was the right side of history? And at this point, their historical ignorance very rapidly manifests itself. So, yeah, I think there's superficiality about all of this. I also think, by the way, that the Americans, excuse me, American friends, but the Americans have a lot to answer for all of this, because it is the degradation of public discourse, which was accentuated in the early part of the 20th century by American populist parties, and which we see again triumphant in the language of Donald Trump. But it's that kind of coarse, oversimplified, purely rhetorical rant that, which then of course gets commercialized for advertising in the 1950s and 60s and so on, that progressivism, marriage equality, these are just the slogans of people who can't think or don't want you to think. And by the way, and so are traditionalism and conservatism, used in certain other contexts.
Hi, you mentioned, great speech, you mentioned earlier about...
Not as good as the song, you have to wait for that.
You mentioned that the different style of different pontiffs, and you said that Pope Francis speaks in a way that's more, sorry about that, it's a bit off the cuff, and he doesn't speak in an academic way. And that when you speak in an academic sort of way, that means that you're thinking about the counter-argument, you're thinking about, you know, the potential implications for debate, etc. Pope Francis doesn't speak that way, and hence, you know, his style is regarded as off the cuff. May I suggest that, or what your thoughts are on that, seeing as he is a pope in 2016 and he's followed by a press pack all the time, and you know, the media is always there. Don't you think that he should perhaps take up added responsibility to perhaps be aware of the implications of some of the things that he says, knowing that they will be distorted, much like this microphone?
Okay, so two things about that. First of all, when I was referring to John Paul II and Pope Benedict as having been academics and this sort of influenced the way they spoke, I didn't really have in mind so much that they were speaking in academic language, so much that one thing that if you're an academic of any kind, really, an historian, philosopher as I am, or whatever else it may be, social scientists of various kinds, other kinds of scientists, one thing that you understand is that when you say something, there's a context in which you're saying it, right? That it's meant to be an answer to a question, or it's meant to be a thesis that you're advancing. And so you're conscious of the fact that, first of all, you tend to be very precise about what it is you're wanting to say. You choose your terms very carefully. And then secondly, when you think about what you want to say, you have to think about how do we square that with what I've said before, and also, what might somebody say by way of reply. So it's not necessarily that you then think, so you then speak in an academic language. It's rather that you're just used to the idea of placing your thoughts carefully within a structure of expectations, objections, and so on and such like, right? So that's the first point. Actually, I can illustrate this rather sort of dramatically with a story that was told me by somebody called Charlie Burns, who served for many years in Rome. I think he's still in Rome now, but he'd be quite an old man now. But Charlie Burns was at one point secretary to the Vatican Library, and he was much liked, a Scot, so that partly explains it, but he was much liked in Rome, and Paul VI, he first served under Paul VI. Anyway, when Paul early on, but at one point in the pontificate of Paul VI, there was a document lying on his desk, a letter or a document that he was to sign, and he hadn't signed it, and so his secretary said, Your Holiness, excuse me, there is this letter to sign, if you could please sign this. And he said, yes, I'll come back. But anyway, days passed, he still hadn't signed it, and Paul VI was generally pretty good at sort of signing off documents. Anyway, he said, at one point, he said, yes, I'm not sure. He said, could you ask, go and get Monsignor Burns, Charlie Burns. So Charlie Burns turned up and said, yes, Your Holiness, what can I do for you? He said, I'm a little concerned about this document that I have to sign here. He said, I think we have said, by the way, we here is the pontifical we, the plural, i.e. the Pope. I think the Pope has said something else previously and it might contradict this and so on. And Charlie Burns said, I can't really think of anything you said. And so we said, well, go and check it. Anyway, Burns came back about 2 weeks later, whatever it was, he said, you're absolutely right, 1623. So in 1623, a Pope had said something which had Paul VI signed off on this document, there would have been a problem, because it would have contradicted what had been said in 1623. Now the point about that is that's an exaggerated form, but when you're a Pope, you have to think very carefully before you speak, or be very used to speaking in a highly coherent and rigorous way on your feet. It's easy to forget that you are Pope. I know that sounds extraordinary. Cardinal Ratzinger did it more than once. He did it in the Regensburg Address. I think he simply forgot that he was the Pope. He said things which, had he remembered that he was the Pope, he ought not to have said. I think his judgment was imprudent on that occasion, but I think he was just forgetful. It's very easy to forget, It's like we have this issue, shall I say, problem or charming feature of the monarchy in Britain. Prince Charles, or even more so his father, the Duke of Edinburgh, just speak their mind, right? And then everybody else has to run around behind them picking up or whatever gets left when animals leave things on the ground and so on. Right? There is a touch of that, I'm afraid. I'm a pontifical consultor, and so occasionally the BBC will ask me, what had the Pope been when he said so and so? I've taken to declining those invitations to comment. So I do take your point, yeah, but I think one has to be sympathetic and understand, that the other thing, remember, is the generation to which he belongs is simply unused to the circumstances in which everybody around you has a camera, they can record things you say in one thing or another. But I think that it would be prudent to maybe, if not say less, confine your comments to matters that are not likely to give rise to questions of profound interpretation. But in saying that, I'm not disagreeing, I think, with anything that he said. I just mean it's a matter of style and tone. Manner.
With issues like, the abuse scandal and same-sex marriage arising, debates continually increasing over the current times, tying into the question that was just asked, if you're not super well informed, or there's particular issues you have with articulating certain things in public forum, would you recommend just remaining silent, or giving it a go, engaging in those debates, or what
That's a very good point. I think that it's an excellent question, actually, a very practical question. I think that there are, first of all, one has to try to form a kind of realistic assessment of one's own capacity, one's knowledge, one's experience, and so on. And there are times when, this is easy to say, but there is a responsibility. If you're going to speak on issues where what you speak may influence those around you, fellow students or people you work with, or whatever else it may be, then one has to think, am I really in a position to do this? And if I'm not, well, how can I inform myself so that I might be better placed to do so? Or perhaps be in a position in which one would say, look, I don't, I can't answer this, but I'd like to sort of direct you to something else, or point in the direction of something else. But I do think that it's a feature of, because of social media and the styles of communication that, just are rampant these days, we do forget the difference between competence and incompetence, or as the great 19th century liberal English philosopher John Stuart Mill said, we forget the difference between the wise and the otherwise. Right? Now, most people are otherwise, right? Those are the facts of the matter. Most people are otherwise. But we live in a culture in which everybody's opinion is meant to be worth hearing, or at any rate, everybody feels that their opinion is worth hearing. And so people, particularly with Twitter, just rattle off idiocies. Right? I mean, I have a daughter who cannot eat any food whatsoever put on a plate without photographing it, right, and then putting it up on and she, to her credit, she's a strict vegan, as are three of my children. She's a strict vegan, and so she has this kind of hashtag vegan, whatever it is, and so on. And she tells me that her followers are now up to 5,000 or something of that sort. So I guess there's something exciting about having people all over the world. In Brazil, see what you've just eaten in Sydney or something like that, right? But not just eaten, just about to eat. Sorry, but given that sort of, unfiltered the noise, I think better not just to contribute to it unless one's really got something to say, and recognising whether one has or does not have something to say itself calls for judgment. And then, but then if one feels oneself may not be in a position to, make the direct contribution, then support people who can and encourage others and so on. But I think we have to, in general, recognise that there really is such a thing as, there is such a thing as knowledge, I mean, in any other, in chemistry, can you imagine somebody saying, oh, so you say it's got 2 carbon bonds, but hey, what do I think? I think it's got 6 or something like that. Well, you can try and say, look, do you actually know anything about chemistry? No, but I'm entitled to my view. I'm trying to say, no, you're not. Right? Just go away. Now, likewise, why should we think that, anybody is qualified to think about these matters and so on? I mean, let there be discussion, but let's not just confuse people saying things with people knowing what they're talking about.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. My question is, we hear from a lot of people the idea of doctrine and how the church doesn't change its doctrine, and how the Pope hasn't gone against any doctrine. But obviously the church is, helps people go to heaven through them understanding doctrine, and the externalities and the beliefs that it represents or enacts are quite important. I remember reading Roger Scruton, who actually criticised the Catholic Church for its move in the 60s to have a huge, not an evolution, but an actual change to its liturgy, because it kind of undermined the idea that God doesn't change. So the practice that we did or conducted ourselves in undermined an actual doctrine that we hold to. And obviously the changes that happened through the church have led to, you can question whether they've led to other things, such as the last exhortation, which introduced the idea of situational individual situational ethics, the fact that our conscience becomes a very important aspect rather than the objective natural law that the church has always held to, the idea of religious freedom, which today has a very different meaning to the freedom that would have been addressed by the Church for 1900 years. The Pope didn't change doctrine, but he celebrated 500 years of the Reformation, which personally, is a bit of an affront to the thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that died because of the Protestant Reformation. I'm just wondering what you think the bishop should be doing and the Pope should be doing, not only to maintain doctrine, which the fact that we're having this question is unbelievable, because doctrine shouldn't even be a question, it can't change, but the fact that is the Pope and are the bishops doing enough to make sure that the Church realises the external beliefs that we hold, the practices that we hold, to maintain doctrine so that people believe in the true faith, rather than bringing our consciences, which sound a lot like your definition of the Protestant movement, which seems to be coming into the Catholic understanding as well, even in the recent exhortation.
Right, gosh, thank you very much. I think it is time for me to sing. Let me just very briefly, because these are obviously very large issues. First of all, I think it would be useful here to distinguish between doctrine in a broad sense and dogma in a more precise and specified sense. So, for example, we have the great 19th century convert to Roman Catholicism from Anglicanism, John Henry Newman, who writes very insightfully and with great energy, really, on the question of the development of doctrine. Now, the notion of the development of doctrine is not new at all. What he's trying to do is to try to understand it and its limits and its logic, as it were. But if you take, for example, Marian dogmas, right, the definitions of Mary's Immaculate Conception, the definition of Mary's bodily assumption, first of all, let's recognise that those are only very, very recent dogmatic definitions. Now, of course, there's a much more ancient doctrine, which is that of Mary as Mother of God, the Theotokos, and that is very important. But on the basis of that, in the Middle Ages, people like John Duns Scotus, for example, argued, and Aquinas argued the other way, that for the Immaculate Conception, that Mary was conceived without stain of original sin. But it is worth noting, Thomas Aquinas didn't believe that. John Duns Scotus did, and John Duns Scotus's view came to secure approbation in due course. But I mean, 7 centuries later, 7.5 centuries later, became dogmatically defined. So there is, it's not simply a matter of, as it were, as everything appeared on page, on day one, as it were, all down there, right? There is the articulation and elaboration of certain questions. And indeed, the dogmatic definition of papal infallibility, as you know, only comes in the 1870s. Now, I'm not saying they're inventions, I don't think that at all, but they are, as it were, the process of centuries of reflection on the deposit of faith. So I think that, we have to recognise that that process is ongoing. So, for example, there are some people who want to see a third Marian dogma defined, the co-mediatrix of Mary. That's not going to be defined. It's not going to be defined. It's been reflected on, it's been deliberated, and it's been rejected. It's not going to be defined. But there will be other matters in which it may prove necessary for there to be dogmatic definitions. But even when there aren't dogmatic definitions, there will go on being interpretation of what doctrine teaches. So I'm open to the idea of doctrinal development in that sense. What there can't be is any rejection of what has previously been held to be part of the essential doctrine, and certainly not of what has been dogmatically defined. Now, you talk about religious liberty and questions of conscience. I think part of what goes on here, we'll just take the case of conscience, because that's the more sort of prominent one. A lot of talk about conscience that you get in the present day from sort of revisionist Catholics, right? People who know how to describe themselves as progressive Catholics, you will struggle to find foundation for in any concilial, any declaration of a council, or any apostolic statement, or encyclical, for example, papal encyclical. So, for example, one thing that people go on a great deal about is the primacy of conscience. I stand to be corrected on this, but I can't think that the phrase the primacy of conscience occurs in any of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and certainly doesn't occur in any document prior to that. The notion of conscience within traditional Catholic moral theology, really, conscientia is judgment. It's a kind of judgment, a judgment about particular cases. But that judgment has to be informed by a grasp of general moral principles and so on. Now, there may be such a thing as conscientious difference. What I mean is people genuinely exercising their conscience as far as they can best understand, coming to a different verdict on a particular issue. But that's only against a background of agreement on the fundamental moral principles. And those fundamental moral principles come to us through the teaching authority of the Church, through the role of the bishops and pope and councils, and individually actually with local magisteria, through the handing on of teaching on matters of faith and morals. So I think that part of what you might be concerned about is where people just kind of, play fast and loose with certain notions, such as the notion of conscience. And so here again, I want to say, look, don't blame. I mean, there may be loose talk. The thing, but I don't think the Church as such, as it were, that you're going to be able to pin onto it the kind of. Maybe I don't want to suggest you're saying this, but the kind of errors or twistings and turnings and so on. What I do think, however, is, and what really does appall me, is the level of education, religious education, that is common among Catholics, and even people, often I'm afraid to say, well, let's just say, people who had the sort of training that was meant to equip them to have the kind of knowledge that they need to have. I will just give you an example of this, and you can just be scandalized or not. I had to explain to a cardinal, I mean, maybe he just was tired. I had to explain to a cardinal the difference between allowing married men to be ordained and allowing the ordained to marry. Right? So there's a difference. The question of married clergy in the Roman Catholic Church is like the question of women's ordination. The Church believes there is no historical precedent for allowing clergy to marry. There is no historical precedent for allowing clergy to marry. That belief is shared between the Western and Eastern churches, between the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches. In the Orthodox Church, you can enter the priesthood as a married man, but the episcopate, the bishop status, is reserved to monks, so they have to be celibate. And if you go in married and your wife dies, you can't remarry. Any discussion about the question of ordaining married men is just that. It's a question about whether or not married men should be ordained to the priesthood. There is no question and no possibility of allowing people who are already ordained to marry. Anyway, as I say, it was a bit of a struggle to try to explain this difference to a cardinal, and I thought, we are in pretty bad times. Just educationally, right? When a cardinal, maybe, as I say, he was probably just tired at the time. But at any rate, but I think this is a very interesting point. And again, no change on that could occur short of a full ecumenical council of the Western and Eastern churches. There could be a change with regard to the discipline of whether married men could become priests. That's a different matter. And I suspect you will be shocked to hear I have argued both in private and in public that the Church should now be considering ordaining married men to the priesthood, but that's a different matter.
Yes. Please put your hands together for John Haldane. So I'm sorry, we could have gone on with questions. We had other people wanting to ask questions, but we had to wrap it up. I wish I could say that there's some other events where they might be able to ask you questions actually, but I believe this may be your last public lecture in Sydney. I know you've got a couple of other talks in Fremantle, but I don't think you've got any other public events in Sydney before you head back.
I'm doing something. I'm just trying to think. I'm doing a couple of talks next week, but I think they're in private. I think I'm doing 3 talks, but I think they're on private settings. Yeah, so
sorry, man, not invited, basically.
Not invited. Unless you want to be a massive donor to the Catholic Church here in Australia, I can probably squeeze you in. Okay.
So if you'd like to follow any more of John Haldane's work, the University of Notre Dame has a media gallery of many of his public appearances out here in Sydney, and we're constantly updating the page with talks and radio clips and articles of his, so you'll be able to find out more information about some of his work there. But that's pretty much it for tonight. We will post the video, thanks to Joe and Patrick, who are always videoing and photographing our events. So the photos, the video will be up on the Theology on Tap website quite soon. But that's pretty much all from me tonight. Stick around, the bar's open till late, the steak and chips are good. Please, once again, thanks John Haldane.